My name is Kelly Madigan Erlandson, and I've been living in Lincoln, Nebraska since 1980. I was born on an Air Force base in Massachusetts, and my father was in the Air Force, so we moved around to several different states while I was growing up. I lived in Nebraska a couple of different times prior to being in Lincoln. I went to part of my elementary school years in Bellevue, moved away, moved back and finished high school in Bellevue, and then ended up coming to Lincoln to go to school at the university. So that's how I ended up here, and like many who come here, I stayed. I attended the University of Nebraska here in Lincoln and started out as an English major and had a lot of personal interest in the alcohol and drug field. So I took a class to fill one of my core requirements for my English major, and was recruited into an alcohol and drug counseling program, partly because they had a shortage of counselors at that time. It was in the early 80s, and they had a shortage of drug and alcohol counselors in Nebraska and almost guaranteed jobs for people after they completed this program. At the time, I had only been thinking about being a poet, and there were never any jobs for poets, and so I thought it might be a good career move to switch over, so I did that. You know, in terms of influences, I think there's influences in the landscape and also just influences in terms of books I've read and writers that I've been exposed to, and I'd like to talk about both of those things. I've always been a person who has experiences in nature that are very profoundly moving. So anytime that I have been able to spend time in natural environments, I have found myself just really filled with that experience and needing to express it. And so it almost always results in some writing for me. And I've lived in lots of different kinds of areas, and in some places it seems like it is a little bit easier at first to figure out how to access wilderness experiences or nature experiences. And when I was in Nebraska in my 20s, I think that I really struggled with that. I didn't have a lot of resources. I had a broken down car and not a lot of money, and it was hard for me to know where to go, to be alone in on the prairie or alone in kind of wild areas, which is something that I realize now I really need to have. So that is something that has really developed for me as an adult in Nebraska, and I have come to love, all that is offered by plains experiences, prairie experiences. I have fallen totally in love with the sandhills. Love to go out there. I have a goal to canoe or kayak all of the navigable rivers in Nebraska, and I think I have a portion of 6 or 7 of them done, and quite a few yet to do. There's actually a lot of river miles in Nebraska, and somebody told me, I haven't fact-checked this, but I think it's probably true that Nebraska has more river miles than any other state. If you think about it, the Missouri's on the one edge and the Platte going through, and because the Platte is braided, it's an awful lot of river miles. So lots of great canoe and kayaking experiences to be had here, even though people from other parts of the country might not think of Nebraska as a kayaking destination. We have a river in Nebraska that's one of the top 10 kayaking and canoeing rivers, which is the Niobrara, but also a lot of lesser known kinds of experiences here too. I love that we have the Nebraska Star Party. I love to tell people that one of our claims to fame is that we have the darkest skies. And so, astronomers come from all over the place, for this congregation of people 1 week a year out of the year to be able to look at the sky through all different kinds of telescopes. Because other than, I believe, Central Australia, on land, we're the darkest that you can get. So, or at least, yeah, well, that's what I hear. I could be making some of this up, but I'm pretty sure of it. So, yeah, so we really, I think we have a lot to offer that isn't always apparent immediately. And so I have really been, over the years nurtured by the landscape here, and find that it shows up a lot in my writing as well. So Other kinds of influences, of course, are, you know, I've been influenced from the time I could read, or probably before that when I was being read to, you know, and I had favorite childhood books like Winnie the Pooh and Black Beauty and, you know, just lots of different kinds of authors that have influenced me over the years. But I think it's really important to talk about the fact that Nebraska also appears to have an incredibly supportive network of writers. And when I talk to people who move here from other areas, it's not like this other places. And so I really feel blessed to have the support and the influence of people who are just, you know, astonishing writers and just, you know, hugely talented. And it's like we have this hidden pocket, you know, of enormous talent here, and people are so generous with their time and their support and their teaching. So I would say that there was a period of time where I was really an isolated writer, and that would be like after I had left the university and was busy raising a family and working in the drug and alcohol counseling field, and not really exposed to a lot of people who were writing. And at that time I was writing primarily poetry, and most people kind of glazed over if you told them that. So I learned not to talk about that in some circles. But you know, there was a time where I began to realize that if I was going to grow as a writer, I really needed to learn from other writers. And so I actually wrote a letter to Marge Sizer, who's a local poet and wonderful poet. And I wrote her, I'd been to a reading that she had done. Maybe it was here. And it's possible it was in the Heritage Room. And I went to a reading, and I just knew that I needed to connect with her. So I wrote her this letter that probably sounded really desperate, you know. And I said, you know, you don't really know me, but I need writers. You know, I need to somehow get connected to writers in this town. And Marge got right back to me and said, let's go to coffee. And we went to Village Inn, and we started doing some writing together. And she introduced me to a lot of people. And I remain just incredibly grateful to her for that, because it just felt like a bridge, you know, into a world that I was feeling kind of left out of at the time. Another thing that had a huge impact on my writing life in Nebraska is the Nebraska Book Festival, which used to be called the Nebraska Literature Festival. And that was a place also where I was able to meet a lot of writers and connect with people, get exposed to some of the amazing work, you know, writing work that's being done in Nebraska. And I met some people my first couple of years going to the Literature Festival that are still my writing partners today. You know, people who continue to be very important in my writing process, people I turn to for constructive feedback, you know, people that I call up and say, oh, I got to tell you this, you know, and they know what I'm talking about. So I feel this gratitude, not just to those writers, but I feel gratitude to the people who put on those events, you know, and it might sound kind of corny or something, but you know, I truly think about what if that didn't exist, because it's not in every state, you know, it's just not. And so to be able to go to this event and mill about with all these other writers and to find my people, you know, it was really a great experience. And so I've gone every single year since I first went. The first time I went was in Shadron, which I think was in '99. And I've gone every year since then, except one year where I had to be out of town. So I just don't miss it. I just love to be there. And yes, and it's where I met you, Meredith. And I was glad to meet you. I have a really distinct memory of being 4 years old and wanting to know how to read. And I was the youngest in my family, and I was jealous that everybody else in the house could read and I couldn't. And my sister had this little phonics set, and it was there were records and a little booklet. And I remember going into the basement of our house, and I felt like I was getting away with something, so I probably had like stolen my sister's record set and record player or something. And I played that record over and over again, just staring at this book, trying to learn how to read. I was so desperate to learn. And And then there was this moment where it was about vowels. I remember it was about vowels, and they kept saying this sentence, "Lady, I owe you some sugar." And then they'd say A-E-I-O-U, and then it'd be in the book. And I was just, puzzling over this and what these symbols meant and what this had to do with sugar. But I had this moment of clarity where it all sort of fell into place, and that is just a central memory for me, and I think that for any writer to be able to answer the question, when did you become a writer? I think the question is really, when did you become a reader? And so for me, it was when I was 4, and it was in the basement of my house when we lived in St. Louis, and it was with stolen property. So I certainly have done some form of writing my whole life, either writing in journals. I've been a huge pen pal. I write to a lot of people. I handwrite letters still. And I worry about email. I love email, and I write a lot of email. But I worry about people losing the ability to recognize each other by their handwriting, because I think that's such a precious thing. When I look at a letter now from my grandmother, who's deceased, and I have this affection for her handwriting. And if we only do email, of course, we'll lose that. So, but I've written a lot of letters, and I have been lucky to have people to correspond with, people who also enjoyed writing letters. And I was writing poems all through, junior high and on. And I think as I've gotten older, I have explored other genres, and I, for a long time, wrote poetry. And when I began to have my work critiqued, I got a lot of feedback about my poetry being very narrative and kind of prosy, like it was too prosy. It's not, it's more like prose than poetry. And I struggled with that for a while, and then I just started writing prose, because then that seemed like the natural solution to that. So then I started writing short essays, and I feel like I'll never exhaust all the possibilities. I just feel like there's so much to explore in the world of writing, and that it's a process not only of discovering the new work, but also that it's a process of self-discovery. I do have things that inspired me to write, but I would say that a lot of my writing is very organic. That I talked earlier about having these almost mystical experiences when I'm in wilderness areas, and I think that really probably 80% of my writing has been born from those experiences. I don't really know how to say this in a way that makes sense, but I feel like my writing, or a lot of my writing, comes out of things that are stored in the body. It's as opposed to just being an intellectual process of thinking about something you want to write about and then writing it. It instead seems to come from other parts of my body besides my brain. And I think that somehow, brushing up against things in nature is a way that my body kind of attaches itself to information in the world. Another way to talk about that, which is also a little strange, is this idea. I've thought a lot lately about creativity and about how ideas get born in the world. And one of the things that has intrigued me is that the idea that certain kinds of information come to our awareness through different people in different places who don't have connection to each other. An example of that is that calculus was invented by 2 different people in 2 different countries at approximately the same time. So when I think about that, I find that just really, something that intrigues me greatly, and so I kind of work that over in my head. And I know that it's true of other kinds of ideas. There's, somebody over here in San Diego is working on this project, and it fits with something that somebody in Italy is doing. And so my idea about creativity and about how ideas move into our consciousness is a little bit like that collective unconscious. And the way I visualize that is like groundwater. So there's this groundwater that is the imagination, or the collective imagination. And it's finding its way to the surface, and it's going to find its way through the easiest possible route. And so what I always say is that the universe is looking for somebody who has a pen in their hand. so if you're writing every day or you're writing, frequently, then that opportunity for the idea to come up through you and out of the end of your pen and onto that paper is certainly enhanced. So, for a long time, I thought that my two worlds were very separate. The drug and alcohol counseling, which I was extremely passionate about, and really have a lot of empathy for people who are struggling with issues with addiction and have been active in that field and have wanted to reach out to people and have reached out to people. And then I had this writing life, which seemed completely separate. And at times people would say, well, do you ever write about your work? And I was like, oh, no, that's my day job, that's the day job, and this is the art or something like that. But increasingly, I'd say in the last several years, there's so much overlap between the two. Specifically, of course, I have this book coming out later this year that is a how-to manual for people who are trying to get sober. And I had never really wanted to write that kind of book. I thought of myself as a poet and an essayist and not necessarily a self-help writer. But it somehow came to me, I guess through the groundwater, that there were people who just needed this information, and not everybody who needs treatment for alcoholism or drug addiction can get it. It's not available to everybody. It costs money to go to treatment. If you don't have insurance or you don't have financial resources to go, then you may end up on a pretty long waiting list to get help. And it bothered me that people who need help right now, sometimes we're not able to access that. So I ended up writing this how-to book, which I'm very glad to have written, and I'm very excited that I have my first book coming out later this year. And somehow working on that project collapsed the boundaries between the two, those false boundaries between what I thought of as those two separate lives. So now I've been writing poetry about, alcoholism, and it's been fun. It's been really interesting. So it feels like more whole. Depending on my circumstances at various times, I've had to write at different times of the day. There was a period of time where I was working full time. I have two daughters who are mostly grown now. One just got married, and one is a senior in high school this year. And when they were younger, of course, there was more intensive parenting involved. And so I would get up really early, like 5:30, and I would write in the morning. And I sometimes would write in the evening before I'd go to bed. And on a couple of occasions, I was writing away, and I fell asleep over my keyboard. And I had to say, Kelly, whatever you're composing here, probably isn't that brilliant. You probably should just go to bed. So I did. Again, my friend Marge Sizer said, Kelly, you write on the fringes of the day, And I kind of liked that saying. I've learned, that it is important to write frequently. And I think, Karen Shoemaker is one of my writing partners and somebody I've learned a great deal from. And I would say that she's been one who has taught me that. And so, I have the luxury right now of having a little more time. I'm not working full time anymore. I have more time to write, and I'm enjoying that. I don't have to get up quite as early. For 25, 30 years, I thought that I was a poet. And then I mentioned that I'd started writing essays, personal kind of lyrical essays. And then I ended up writing this self-help book, which is, nonfiction. And then this thing happened to me in September of this year, where I had a character, like a fictional character, come into my head. Now, I have a lot of friends who are fiction writers who talk about having a character tell a story, and they're just kind of putting the story down. This character's in their head wanting to have the story told. And I always just refrained from diagnosing them when they would tell me that. But seriously, it was a really cool process to me, and I'd be like, wow, that's neat, but that's never happened to me. I'm not a fiction writer. So this character showed up in my head, started hanging around, and I was at first kind of laughing at this character. I said, you're in the wrong place. Okay, I am not a fiction writer. Okay, and for a long time it was just mostly this name. I had this name. So finally, after about 6 or 8 weeks, I just started this dialogue and said, if you're going to want me to write this story, you're going to have to give me more than a name. book. So then more started coming. So I would say for the last couple of months, I've been writing some short pieces that appear to be fictional. I've never written fiction before. I'm very nervous about it, but it's always exciting to me to move, over into something a little bit different. So, yeah. So maybe someday you'll see a little fiction out of me. I don't know. We'll see. If I get really brave, I might read a little bit tonight. I've written particular pieces that seem to have a listening audience member, sort of imaginary audience member that I was writing to. I know that when I wrote the Getting Sober book, there was a guy who was in his late 30s or early 40s that I was writing this book to. And it's not a real person, but it was just this, I just had this guy, this sort of everyman, in terms of, people with alcohol problems. And I was just thinking about him and what would he need to hear? What would I tell him if I had a chance to talk to him? And so I did have this imaginary audience member. I'd say most of the time that I write, I don't have that. I'm not aware of having that in most of my writing, but in that situation I did. If someone came to me with questions about writing, I would say, you are so lucky to be in Nebraska, with all these very generous writers willing to help you. I would probably talk about writing frequently, and I would talk about getting connected. Those things that took me a while to do, but getting connected with other writers and being willing to get some feedback on your work, and to share ideas with people and to just kind of, fill the well. Yeah, I mentioned that I have this apparently this new fiction work that's going on, but I don't have a long-term goal in terms of my writing. To me, a lot of it's very exploratory, and I am excited about the process itself. I don't like to know ahead of time how things are going to turn out in my writing, in poems or stories or anything. So I want to discover it as I'm going. So I don't have some kind of, I can't tell you my 5-year plan and my 10-year plan. I just really hope to be able to continue to have the opportunity to write.
Good evening. Thanks for coming out this evening. It's great to see you all here. My name is Meredith McGowan, and I am the curator of the Heritage Room. And I'd like to welcome you to the room and to the John H. Ames reading series. We're excited that this reading series has been around now for more than 20 years. And in fact, this is the 166th reading. So that's great. We are here in the Jane Pope Geske Heritage Room of Nebraska authors, and it is a special collection that promotes and preserves works by and about Nebraska authors. And we have a collection of almost 13,000 volumes. And in fact, I did hear an exact number recently, and it was 12,904. So now you know that was maybe 2 months ago. So it could be a few more than that, but it's somewhere in that range. And we have more than 3,000 Nebraska authors represented in the room too. And I see a few people who do have works in this room that are in the audience tonight. We do invite you to visit the Heritage Room during our regular hours. We are open Tuesday through Friday from 12 to 3 and on Sundays from 2 to 5. So you might want to come back and look at some of the works by the Nebraska authors. You might want to look at some of the artwork that's on the walls too. So we'd be glad to see you anytime. We'd also like to thank the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association. We're able to bring you special programs like these because of an endowment established through their volunteer efforts over the years. Tonight, our reader is Kelly Madigan Erlandson. It seems to me, and I guess we talked about this a little bit earlier, that Kelly has several lives, and I guess a lot of us do have several lives, don't we? She is a poet and an essayist who has published works in literary journals such as Natural Bridge, the Massachusetts Review, and Crazy Horse. She's also won awards, and she most recently won the Distinguished Artist Award in nonfiction from the Nebraska Arts Council in 2006. And in her other life, well, she may have more lives than this too, I'm not sure. Anyway, she has worked as a drug and alcohol counselor since about 1983, I believe. And this work led her to write a book that I assume might be slightly different from the poetry that she writes, although maybe it isn't different than the poetry and the essays that she writes. And it is a book entitled Getting Sober, a practical guide to making it through the first 30 days. And it will be released by McGraw-Hill later this year. So we're very glad to have Kelly Madigan Erlandson here with us this evening. If you could help me welcome her, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you, Meredith. Thank you, all of you, for coming out tonight. It's been kind of a cold week, and Christmas is over, and holidays, and everybody's kind of settling in, I think, with their good books and movies at home. So I appreciate you getting off the couch and into your cars and down here for this tonight. I know I like to burrow in about this time of night, so. I am a writer who has been a little bit confused about her genre. I, for many years, thought that I was a poet, and then when I got feedback that my poems were too narrative and prosy, I decided to write personal essays, and did that for a while, and then came to write this how-to self-help book, Getting Sober, and later I might tell you that I'm even more confused than that and moving into other genres. So I want to read just a little bit about, a little bit from each of those categories. And with my poetry, I'd like to share kind of a sample of poetry, kind of representative of the last 5 years or so. And I'm going to start with a poem that is an explanation. I have a lot of extended family that don't live in Nebraska, and when I go home to visit them, they say, I know how you ended up there, but why do you stay? And so this is called They Ask Why I Stay. I tell them it is the quality of life. Low crime, affordable housing, good schools is what they think I mean. The rope that phrase makers loop so harmlessly around our throats that we think it is a ribbon, dangling a medal of citizenship or justice or free speech on our chest. Instead, it is the grasshopper, sunfish yellow, that my husband said was big as a mouse, and it was, awkwardly walking the rung of the wisteria's ladder against the peeling paint of the garage wall. How the neighbor thought to point it out to us, and how we both looked when he did, and agreed it was the biggest we had seen. It is the slam of wooden screen door into its frame. Window glass so heavy it long since broke its cording, dropped the counterbalance weights inside the plaster walls, and how we have to prop them open now with a can of green beans or hanger. It is the great, great, great of cicada in late summer so loud we have to raise our voices on the porch swing. It is the way the climbing rose has thrown her arms across both living room windows, pressing thorns and blooms against the glass for our approval. It is that when she does, we give it. Thank you. I'm going to have a little system up here so I don't just start reading the same work over again at the end. Before she decides. They are in a dark plum thicket, and she is too far above the ground. Can feel the lift and fall of walking, but is not walking. Beneath her are the shoulders of a boy who is willing to carry her for years. But he is unsteady as a shirt unbuttoned in the wind, and she is like a feather on the surface of a river with round stones in its bed. She already knows he will fall, and because she is above him, she will fall further. But that doesn't matter yet. The night held up all around her, like great bolts of cloth for her choosing. I'm lucky to have my family here tonight, and my husband appears in several poems, probably already has appeared. I think he did in the first poem. But I do have a poem about my oldest daughter, and I have a poem about my youngest daughter, so I'm going to read both of those. And the first one is about my oldest daughter, and it's, well, before I actually met her. So, after the test said yes. This is kind of a true story, too. Stopped at the crossroad on 14th Street, ice clean as an apple slice under my wheels. I am waiting for my turn, and I don't know yet about looking back, which is why I cannot describe the color or make of what hit me. Moving too fast to brake on the black, and my blue Volkswagen shoots out into oncoming lanes, and once there, begins to spin. And that is where time slows, like they always say, forming an opening in the day that was already thick with news. The man comes to the car window, wants to know if I'm okay, and I tell him I'm pregnant, that I just found out this morning, and he looks like he will faint. And I open the door and step out into the street, and this, I believe, is the story of conception. How my daughter used momentum and ice and velocity and impact to pierce the atmosphere and enter the world. And this is Maggies Origami. This is my attempt at a sonnet. I felt like I was just wrapped up in little pieces. Well, I was trying to write this sonnet. It has a lot of rules, and I don't like rules very much. If you know me, you might know that already. So I haven't written a lot of sonnets, but I did write this one. She says she's good at folding things in half, and I'll admit, I think it's quite a skill. This is the child who always makes me laugh long past the point at which I've said, "Be still." She'll grimace, blow a kiss, or pirouette in order to avoid the route to bed. Fall backwards off the couch until I fret she'll lacerate her knee or crack her head. She's leapt from bunk beds, flipped from diving boards, had stitches, cat scratch fever, broken bones, then stayed up late to practice scales and chords, or organize each item that she owns. She folds my tension, makes it happiness, Zen master of the art of goofiness. Sometimes I get a poem out of a story that somebody else told me, and that's where this poem came from. It's called 25 Years Later, She Learns Her Ex is Dying. 5 nights in succession, she recalled him in dreams. His voice was a series of clicks and whistles, the sound of Burlington Northern Santa Fe troubling the long rails. If she starts to walk those tracks, her cupboard doors will spill their store of crackers and oats onto the floor. Her shingles slip from the sure grasp of the roof. Linoleum plans to stall her. The dog knows to sigh and paw the water bowl. Her climbing rose has been positioning itself all summer. Still, she remembers herself as a sundress waving from a makeshift clothesline on the fire escape of a red brick building, or as a banner of blonde hair advertising from the back of a black motorcycle. She wants to take up cigarettes again, sleepwalk, lose both shoes at a party in a neighboring town. She wants to tell him something or sing a chorus of that old Donovan song to him, maybe just over the phone. She remembers shuffling the tarot cards, intuiting a future much more wondrous than the thud of news on her narrow porch, the civil greetings penned to college friends. She wants something old, something stolen. She wants to balance on that rail as though she were not an owner of things, as though the train were due, as though everything still mattered. Sometimes when I go away from my regular life, even for a short period of time, and especially if those times are times where I'm able to immerse myself in the natural world, I I have these mystical experiences. I think I'm maybe a mystic at heart. And I end up writing these short little pieces that I usually email off to my friends. And so they've become these reports. And so I have some reports from Wyoming and a report from the Space Coast. And I'm going to read a couple of those tonight. This one's called Report from Wyoming, Night Sky. Lift, raise, launch, propel, rocket, trigger, sling yourself out of the dark rooms where we seek comfort and consolation. Rush from the church foyers, the basement rooms with low ceilings, the lockers where we try to stow our unwieldy belongings. Away from the flickering light in the family room. From the school gymnasium, the doctor's office, the mortuary. Come out into the world at night. It is arching overhead even now, backbending itself above you as you drain the oily dishwater from the sink. It is battering against your rooftop, your double panes, with its invitation. The sky is chalked with meteors. The northern lights radiate and undulate, and coyotes are whooping their frenzy. Hot mineral springs steam their primordial vapors. The seven sisters have risen over the eastern horizon, while the hunters have packed away their long guns and headed home. The moon dresses and disrobes or rouges her face with the earth's long shadow. Owls ghost the creek bed, while the deer have buckled their knees to rest their white bellies on the ground. Rabbits at the edge of the yard have quieted. The starlight has traveled immeasurably far to shine upon you. Wrap yourself in wool and silk and go out into the night. How can we continue to quail and priss about our complaints, our sourness, our bloat, our trouble? All the while, the elk are moving through the lodge poles. The snow has made a wide path for our sled, and the sky is exploding above us. The world is active with our healing. The heavens are dizzy with love. Let the sky send her restoring waters down upon your face, my darling. Put on your jacket, open the back door, and turn to the north. Sometimes they're not that happy. And I've talked sometimes about this wheel in me that turns, and of course we all have some way of describing that movement out of light and into darkness and back into light and back into darkness. And for some reason, especially in Wyoming, I was experiencing that as a wheel. And so this is called the Report from Wyoming, The Dignity of Wild Things. The wheel that is slowly turning within has moved into darkness. For 2 or 3 days now, a rim of fear lines my belly and perches in the hollow of my throat. Each thing of beauty here, the wing feathers on the roadside, the half moon rising over the hills, the rooster pheasant making his choking cry, each has a hidden pocket of dismay. I trust the wheel to move again, but first it is time to probe these small holdings, forgive old stories. There is such holiness, such exquisite healing in this world that each moment we are here seems weighted with a grave responsibility. I question how many hours of this life I have already spent shamefully. But even letting that thought rest in my mind squanders today's spirit, sets judgment up in a hospital bed in the living room where she can point and submit her complaints. Faced with the grace and dignity of wild things, I ask for a life of order and beauty. I fear that I will forget this, that when I leave this place, I'll surround myself with cast-offs, with old refrigerators, torn out insulation, petrochemicals. I have seen whole lives shuttered by ancient hatreds. I have seen toilets thrown into clear, cold rivers. I come from a race of people who have let the bodies of babies go to landfills. Whatever is humanly possible must reside in each of us. And this black layer is seeping up into my consciousness, flooding my body with chemicals. I am afraid I will misuse my life. Time to change the mood a little bit, I think. Most writers will tell you that if somebody requests a piece, it's very difficult to write it. Can't you write a poem for my dad's 80th birthday? You're a poet. I had this dear friend who was getting married and asked if I would consider writing a poem for her wedding, and I said sure. And then I fretted about it for months and months, and then the wedding got closer and closer, and I didn't write the poem. And then the wedding was on a Saturday morning, and on Friday night I had to go to the rehearsal, and I didn't have the poem. And I didn't want to tell the bride that I didn't have the poem, because you know how brides are. So I told her that oh yeah, I had the poem. My printer jammed up though, and so I couldn't bring the copy down. But oh sure, yeah, I had the poem. We're all set, ready to go. Okay. So we're going through the whole rehearsal, and then the bishop who was marrying them said, "Is the lady with the poem here? Is the lady with the poem here?" And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "Do you have the poem?" I'm like, well, I have the poem. I don't have the poem with me, but I assure you, I have the poem. So he tells me where I'm supposed to stand when I read the poem, and I go up and I'm standing at a little place like this, and he says, "Okay, and so you'll be reading the poem, and this is happening here, and so then could you just give us the last line?" And I said, "What?" And he said, "Could you just give us the last line in the poem so that the next person will know, you know, that it's their turn?" And I thought I was pretty busted at that point, but I just said, when the poem is over, it'll be really obvious. And I think you'll find that that's true. So here's the poem. Written 11 hours before the ceremony. They were surprised to see how there were some details that were just then happening, like in the weather. So, in the aftermath of the meteor shower for Melissa and Craig. There are many ways to join together, many techniques the world employs to knit one thing to another, like the trumpet vine encircling the pine tree with the tiny throats of its blossoms open, or the sure glue of the paper wasp attaching its nest to the underside of an eave. There is the way of the monarch, sealing her egg to the milkweed leaf, or the night sky becoming a bowl for the coyote's layered refrain. There is the way the star shape embeds in the apple and in the cottonwood branch, or how all of the world's rivers conspire to carry the salt of the soil to the ocean, how the strands of spider web lace the late summer garden. And there is this way, in a church on the Great Plains, in the aftermath of a meteor shower, the earth having just passed through the dust trail of a comet unseen since the Civil War. Last night's wind from South Dakota has turned around and originates today from Missouri or Kansas, while on the southeast coast, one hurricane has come to land as its twin twirls out over the Atlantic harmlessly. It is August, and the bees are hovering in the orchards, the branches arcing low to the ground, weighted with fruit. Under a waning crescent moon, in a room lit by colored glass, love has asked a question, and it hangs in the air like the scent of lilac. Love has asked the only question it knows, and the answer is always yes. So I skated through that. And I didn't confess it until a couple weeks later to the bride. So I have some poems that seem to come out of a dark place, and I'm not sure exactly what that's about. And also I will say that for quite a while as a writer, I felt like I had these two separate lives, and Meredith talked about that. I had my day job as a drug and alcohol counselor and a lot of passion for that. And also I had my writing life. And when people would say, do you write about your work? I was like, oh, no, that's my day job. This is my art. And so it took me until just the last few years to understand that it's all mixed up together. It's all just pieces of the whole. And so I think that stories that maybe, pieces of stories I've heard in my work have come alive in poems, and I've eventually, and you'll hear this tonight, wrote a poem about alcoholism, and then of course wrote a book about it. So they've just been weaving themselves together, and that's been an interesting process. There's a very short poem called Negative Capability. He was the boy who outlined the girl's house with gasoline after she had said no more. In him, every sadness grew a shell until it was a cold stone he could let drop from an overpass onto oncoming traffic beneath him. And still in that dark vein, we have boy walking ahead of train. Between the rails, face turned away, he fails to respond to the horn. Trains take miles to break. The engineer considers a jump to the ground, to sprint ahead and throw him off the tracks. But no person could outrun this story. It was music that the walker heard instead of warning. 2 cups at his ears, a fine cord, a silver disc. Behind him, something fast and black. There is so much we do not know. Report from the Space Coast, seen and unseen. My mom lives in the winter in Florida, and she lives on this stretch of land where Cape Canaveral is, where they shoot off the shuttles, and they call it the Space Coast. Milk and honey in my coffee mug this morning down at the beach with an old stork of a chair. Aluminum legs settling into the sand, fabric stretched across the frame. The sun is either not yet up or shied behind the screen of clouds, but the world has already begun to light. Out beyond the curling point of waves, an ocean bird is in meditation on the surface of the water. It blinks in and out of view as the water beneath it sinks and rises, there and not there, there and not there. At the boardwalk behind me, 2 men talk. One half stands on his bicycle. The other is holding his bait and poles. Bicycle man is emphatic, saying he never signed anything, so how could he be held responsible? Fishing man lights a cigarette, shakes his head. Bicycle man is talking with his hands. The story has something to do with his mother. Hurricanes, attempting to reclaim the ancestral nests of sea turtles, have reached an uneasy treaty with development here. The balconies ripped off from their cliff walls, the windows all X'd with wide strips of tape or replaced by the eyelids of particle board. Off to my right, at the edge of the high tide line, is a large fish is stranded, still and gray. The beach walkers each stop for a moment as though at a cemetery marker, examine the carcass, and continue along. Bicycle man tells me it is a grouper when I go over to pay my own respects. It is on its back, mouth open, each gill flared wide. Bicycle man is eager to tell me how it has been moving with the tide, up and down the beach for a week now, first in front of the high-rise condos, then in front of the boardwalk. I wonder how it got there, meaning why this particular one ended up on the beach instead of consumed in the water. He thinks I'm wondering how it died and tells me his theory, that it was hooked by a fisherman and might have fought for an hour or more before breaking free. The hooks stayed inside him, and that was what killed him, he tells me, confident of his conclusions. He tells me the grouper wasn't quite this big at first, but he's swelling up as he begins to decay. The sun throws back the covers and gets up. Dolphins are revealing themselves in slow forward rolls, a dark fin, cresting and retreating, seen and unseen, seen and unseen. Their smooth rhythm is the steady motion of the sewing machine, connecting one layer to another, tied to the top by a spool and tied to the bottom by a bobbin. Pelicans smooth the wrinkles from the fabric with their long glide. Sandpipers carefully cut along the edges of the pattern paper. I am here a long hour before it comes to me that the wide water is only part of the answer I have come for. Maybe the bigger conclusion here is the unobstructed sky. Looking east, I cannot see Highway A1A, cannot even hear the traffic, which must be starting its congestion now in earnest. I cannot see electrical lines, radio and cell towers, clocks on banks, the arches, or oversized hats of convenience food, the Shell oils and Conocos, the paycheck advance stores. This sky belongs to cormorants, to kayakers, to wooden-hulled boats with sails, to gulls and light. This is a sky that dissolves the hooks that have lodged in us, where my own life, with its joys and disappointments, blinks on and off, seen and unseen, here this morning and a little bit further down the beach tomorrow. There are some kind of crazy people in the writing community who do this thing called Nepal Rhyme, which is short for National Poetry Writing Month. And it's a way to celebrate April, which is National Poetry Month, by making a commitment to write a poem every day. So the first year I heard about it, I said, those people are crazy. And the second year I did it. So I got several poems out of it, and I was glad for that. And it was interesting. Sometimes I'd be stomping around the house saying, okay, I gotta do this, I gotta write this note, I gotta pay this bill, and I have to write a poem. It's like so it became something on my list. But this one came out of it, and I was kind of happy with this. The onset of autobiographical memory. A woman says she remembers her own birth. And this is the primary reason she cannot work to feed herself, but must rest in the afternoons with a cool cloth over her forehead. She talks about her birth at odd times. The sensation of air replacing water, like coming up out of the sea from skin diving, water streaming over the crown of her head. She raises the story, an umbrella held between her fingers that fails to shield her. Always the intrusion of recollection, the assault of a multitude of colors after the dim interior, the screech and clank of the world. Ever since, she has found the human voice too precise. Swimming underwater is of some relief, and certain medications kept in large supply at her bedside. This is the way the world has damaged her, the curse of memory starting its engine prematurely. Always she seeks forgetfulness, lying down in the snowdrift, throwing coins into the coated throats of slot machines, rearranging her red dishes in the safety of her cupboards. Still, her bones recall the crush, and the headaches come, and she retreats to the canopied bed, curtains pulled close like a membrane, the pendulum clock a second heartbeat overriding her own. I have a lot of nature images in my poetry especially, and probably in my essays too. And I had a realization about my work when I was taking a writing conference last June at the Nebraska Summer Writers Conference, and I was trying to sort of figure out what's my theme, or what am I about as a writer. And I went back to talking about things in my childhood where I felt like I had to rescue animals all the time, and then I started talking about how I still feel like that, but I get overwhelmed, because there's so many, and you can't rescue them all. And so I started doing some writing. I've done some writing now that's in sort of the metaphorical voice of an animal, and then I've done some writing just about that theme itself. And so this one's called Porcupine, and this is, I guess, metaphorically in the voice of the porcupine. So you think we are the pointed argument, the man drunk at the party showing off his gun collection, the bed of nettles. What we really are is hidden from you. Girl weeping in the closet among her stepfather's boots. Tuft of rabbit fur caught in barbed wire. Body of the baby in the landfill. Boy with the shy mouth playing his guitar at the picnic table out in the dirt yard. We slide into this world benign and pliable. Quills pressed down smooth over back and tail. Only 1 hour here stiffens the barbs into thousands of quick retorts. Everything this well guarded remembers being soft once. Reliquary. Reliquary is where they keep the relics of saints. Some of you probably know that, I'm sure, but saints, I just think this is the most fascinating thing. There's all these stories about saints whose bodies don't decompose, and they store them in places, or they store pieces of their bodies, and so like little, bone from somebody's thumb will be in a big sacred, box somewhere in Europe. So, reliquary. Always I am taking the wounded from the mouth of the hungry, the wet fur of the leveret from the jaws of the hound. Or I am the one with the sledgehammer, the poisoned stake that I slip over the fence after every authority refused to quarantine the beast. I have to protect my own. But the world assigns too many to me, says they are each my own. The lobsters in the tank at the market, the sparrows in the neighbor's trap, the massive tawniness at the edge of the field at dusk. I love the world that wants to eat me, and I crave to devour it too. Smear my face with butter and grease, talk into the night about meals I've had. I am the paralyzed rescuer, watching the nest moan over, waving from the porch as the men head off with their long guns. If I have been sent here for some task, I have blundered, I have failed. I couldn't find the trap door, the men with the proper authority. Yet I rest my feet in the stream and it washes me anyway. And birds make nests of ribbons in my eaves. I'm sorry, I was ill-equipped. I can't even tell you I will do better, but I will collect the bones. I will stand at the roadside and say your names. Porcupine, mule deer, wildcat. I will take what lasts longest, the jawbone set with jewels. Let it bleach in the white heat. I will say I knew you, that I found it by Salt Creek or in the Bighorns. I will show the architecture of your mouth to children. I will let them run their fingertips, whorled with identity, over the tops of your marvelous teeth. I think I've been in Nebraska long enough to have a Nebraska poem, so everybody has to have one, I think, so this is my Nebraska poem, and it's titled, Nebraska. This is a place for things that take time, long histories that need to be unrolled and laid out across oak library tables, with a hard-backed book set on each corner to keep them pressed open. Here we understand that shadows fold their wings and settle down in midday, tucked underfoot like a coyote den the unschooled never notice. We can see a fire in the next county. The smoke, a thundercloud of blackbirds twirling for fall, grouping and regrouping themselves as though to remember something already lost, washed out and splayed in the wet clay of the creek bed. You can drive an entire afternoon here and not see a person. But all the way, the meadowlarks will be opening the doors of their throats, letting out music like milkweed seeds delivered downwind. You might start counting those birds after a while. Picture them as mile markers on the telephone wires, wondering if you've seen the same one over and over again. We have more stars here, so many that strangers think there is something wrong with our sky, that it's fake, or that Sioux women have beaded our night with constellations not seen in Minneapolis or Memphis, fresh ones that we can give names to as we lie on the hood of the car. We can call one Mountain Lion Reclaims Ancestral Home, after the cougar who roamed up a wooded thicket into Omaha this fall, ranging until the zoo director shot him with a tranquilizer dart. Here we can keep naming star puzzles until the threat of sunrise blues the black space above us. This is a place for things that take time, the long stitching together of soft spots in the heart, the wind across the Missouri River Valley, scooping luss into hills unlike any others on this continent. Seeds stored in the cellar of the prairie for 100 years, patient for fire, unable to crack themselves open without it. This is a place where disappointments, deep as aquifer, can spill themselves out, fill up and empty again, as many times as the wound requires. This is a place where a person can heal or choose not to heal. We have both kinds. I'm going to share one more poem with you, and then I'm going to read you just a couple opening paragraphs of my book that's coming out this fall. And this is the poem where I just, quit messing around with those two different lives and just brought them right together. And so if you know anything about alcoholism, people who have it really badly have a lot of physical problems that are related to it. And I work at a treatment center at the hospital, and so people come in and they're really in bad shape a lot of times when they get there. And they have a lot of problems with their internal organs, and sometimes they're really very yellow. They get very jaundiced because their liver's shutting down. And so I'm telling you that because it's going to show up in the poem. So the title of the poem is taken from the Alcoholics Anonymous Big Book, and it's called "Rarely Have We Seen a Person Fail." I have not come to sobriety without reason. The rim of the glass itself insisted. I was collared by bottles let loose from their cardboard cells, who brandished photographs of my unborn children. The clerk, crushing a cigarette behind the liquor store counter, clucked his tongue at my purchases. How could I continue when the cubed ice hurled curses from the cradle of my palm? I have not come to sobriety of my own accord, and no one does. The alchemy failed. Weary of medicating the problem with larger and larger doses of the problem, even I could see the futility. I tried to persist, learned to vomit in order to make more room in my stomach, to prime before events, to hold one hand with the other, to interlock day and night. But longing has distended itself beyond my reach. My organs have drafted armies and built fences at their borders. A yellow dog has rubbed against my skin. I have not come to sobriety without quarrel. Tarot cards foretold a better outcome. I knew the mixers were the culprit. Stringing Jacob's ladder full of promises hasn't quelled the gag reflex, and now my hands are tied. Otherwise, I'd raise them over my head. Otherwise, I would have already surrendered. I have a book coming out. It's due out in August, and I'm very excited about it, and it's been this whole new world for me. Just learning about the whole process and going through it and seeing the book cover and dealing with editors and agents and people that I'm lucky to be able to deal with. So, and it's not the kind of book that one would normally read long sections from in a place like the Heritage Room, but I am going to read the opening paragraphs to you. The book is written directly to the person with a problem. You know, it's designed for someone who knows, you know, I definitely have a problem and I need to get some help and I'm not sure what to do about it and I'm not sure if there is help for me, and, you know, and I've been there, so I understand what that feels like, and so I have some compassion for people who are broken and don't necessarily know the first thing about how to start fixing themselves. So these are just the opening paragraphs, and I'm going to close with this. Whether you think of yourself as alcoholic or as a person with a drinking problem, you can quit drinking. The pain you have caused yourself and others can be healed. The areas of your life that have been devastated by the consequences of your drinking can be repaired. Your spirit can be restored. No matter how bad your situation is, it is possible to go from where you are now to a sober, happy, meaningful life. Chances are you have tried before. You may have attempted to cut down or control your alcohol use by drinking only on weekends, or by limiting the number of drinks you would allow yourself in one evening. Maybe you promised someone that you would quit, but never quite succeeded. Maybe you swore you were quitting for good and picked it back up again that same day or several days later. You might have told yourself that you are weak, that you have no willpower, or that you are a hopeless case. Don't believe that for a minute. If you want to quit drinking, it most likely means you have been through some very bad times that led you to this place. Maybe you lost your job because of your drinking. Maybe you were arrested for driving while intoxicated, and maybe it wasn't the first time. Maybe someone you love has said they can't take it anymore. Maybe things are even worse than that. You might be reading this in the hospital or in jail. Perhaps you have humiliated yourself in some way, or done something you do not think you can forgive yourself for doing. The pain and anguish you are experiencing is the key that can unlock the door to your new life. If you do not like how your life is going, and you're miserable because of the effects of your drinking, if you've tried to quit and failed, if you are tired of always messing things up with your drinking, if you have been brought to tears by your shame or embarrassment or defeat, there is hope for you. Thank you. Thank you.